Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca. If you're here, hopefully you're interested in some nonfiction books or the Booktube Prize in general, because we're gonna today discuss the Booktube Prize semifinals in nonfiction Group A. That is a prize that's run every year, basically by Booktube for Booktube. Anyone can participate as a judge, but you do have to sign up well in advance. So halfway through the year, we are just now getting down to the final round. And this is my assessment for the semifinal. So with this, I had 2 months to read 6 books in nonfiction that were assigned to me and rank them in how I thought. So I've done this a couple different ways over the years, and I decided just to film my initial reactions to the books when I finished them and cobble that together in the order that I've ranked them. So that's what you're gonna get here today. As I am filming this though, I don't know what the finalists are. That list has been determined at the point you're seeing this because I can only put this up once it's been decided, but I'm not sure. So I'm very hopeful that my selections will move forward. The top 3 will go into the final, but we will see. So I'm gonna throw too many versions of past me. All right, I now have read Daughters of the Bamboo Grove, From China to America, a true story of abduction, adoption, and separated twins by Barbara Demick. I would most put this in journalistic nonfiction because while we are centering the story of these twins from China who are separated by international adoption, it's using them as a vehicle to tell the wider story of the China one-child policy and the conflicts between China as a state trying to progress and move forward, but in a very controlling and extreme manner, and pushing, I think, forward-looking ideals like egalitarianism and sex equality, but that being pressed against a society that was still very much holding on to traditions and patriarchy and the core demand of having children, and specifically boys, for families. And those two things being enmeshed, I think, is something that came across really well in being at odds, but working with each other to create harms to this generation of children, and specifically infanticide and abduction and transport of these children elsewhere. So really horrible treatment of a generation of children specifically. And I think that part, the complexity of the two sides of society, was really portrayed well. But what I didn't love about this, and what I really struggled with, is that I very much felt the hand of the author in how things were being portrayed. And you can tell that the author is really personally invested and has been working on this for so long, has been involved in pulling the threads of this story since it was still shadowy and hidden and not out in the open that China were using this policy so extremely that they were killing, that they were kidnapping, that they were implementing these very, very oppressive schemes on these families who had more than one child. And I think, levels of that come across really well also. But what I think the author has done in becoming so personally invested is really taken aside. And so I felt the forced perspective in reading this, and that really frustrated me. I didn't feel like I was getting at all an objective book whatsoever. I think even coming out of it, I felt a negativity toward not just international adoption, but adoption in general, because it was so biased hard toward that point of view, I felt in the reading. I also just found I was really angry at everybody involved in this other than the children. It felt like just everybody was failing the children in willful ways, in corrupt ways, in irresponsible ways. The parents right out of the gate really, really drove me batty because they don't seem to have any sort of strong feeling or preference leaning either direction. But they just sort of go along and have children increasingly because it's what their parents want. And I'm sure some of that wishy-washy element is coming across because of cultural demands and norms, but I found myself frustrated seeing them over and over. After their first child is a girl, they decide to try again for a boy with their second child, who is also a girl. And that girl ends up in really terrible circumstances and being under threat, and they're on the run from their home, and they have to gather up money to try and pay fines for having a second child that they can't afford, and it damages their home, and just everything going wrong. And yet they willfully, again, without having a strong feeling of their own, go forward to have yet another pregnancy that turns into these twins. And they end up in the same circumstance again, where they're on the run and they're shifting around their children, trying to hide them, all because they willfully wanted to try for a boy and they didn't get it. And after the separation of these two girls, one remains with the family and they're able to keep her, but the other, in their shuffling, is abducted by the state family planning and ends up shipped overseas to the US for adoption. But after that happens, they try for and have another child because they so want a boy. And I just found that egregious. I couldn't see continuing to create new children to put through these horrors. And that's exactly what was going on. And it feels like that was just a good allegory for every person involved, every adult involved here, that they willfully just keep doing wrong. And it was so horrible to read. So I found myself very angry reading this, and maybe that tempered a bit of what I was feeling. Not to say that many other places are necessarily doing things better than China, but I also did feel that this was so laboring on how regressive and awful and extreme China's policies were that it at times came across almost catastrophizing. I'm not minimizing any of the horrors that were done here, but it very much did come across as presenting one end of extremes. So I kind of struggled with this book for multiple reasons. I do think the information being presented was good, solid, and I valued reading it for that. But I also don't think this was the best of the books I've read. Well, King of Kings, The Iranian Revolution, A Story of Hubris, Delusion, and Catastrophic Miscalculation by Scott Anderson was certainly a very informative read. This pretty much is focused on the decade of the 1970s and the happenings within the Iranian regime and eventual fall of the Shah or King of Kings during that time. It seems like in the early 70s, as we're building the picture, you get the sense that Iran and the Middle East as a whole are sort of finding their power in the world and really leveraging some of their resources and things that they're able to hold over against world trade. And that catapults them into this wave of capitalistic wealth and well-being for those who have power, while it seems like the people were having a lot of struggles and hardship. So there's this great disparity. But the Shah seems to have kind of bought into his own hype as that decade was going along and is almost living within a bubble of propaganda within his compound. But this doesn't seem to really be about him and his hubris so much as it is about American hubris. And the focus is much more the American diplomatic missteps and limited lens in America literally just simply paying attention to the propaganda, trusting what the regime was telling them as their source, very frequently having diplomacy that didn't even involve learning the language, to speak the language there, and just really not developing networks of information outside of the official party line within the Iranian government. And that led to a lot of problems and unpreparedness for the conflict that was actually going on and the dissatisfaction with the people themselves. So this is a nearly 400-page book. And as I said up front, I felt this was so informative, really richly developed, and something I've never really learned about before, especially not in this depth. It's a very dense book, though. And I feel at the beginning especially, this did taper off, but at the beginning especially, the author is jumping through time a lot. We will be moving through years or even decades of information and facts in the same paragraph at moments. And so I struggled to pull together the timeline as we were going along initially. And that did sort of narrow down as he's established things about the background of Iran and set up for everything. That became much more linear. So I think that was all fine. But eventually, as we head toward the end, it felt like there was a lack of depth and specificity, like we were skipping over things, to where there were choices that the US were making diplomatically, and I didn't understand why. I kept questioning because we would have these moments of the US government inserting themselves in situations, and it didn't really make sense, and there was nothing to tell me why the US government would be interested in this specific thing or this policy that was going on, or a certain situation that would create greater conflict, was like, why do they care about this one thing? And it just didn't make sense. So it felt like over the course of this, he needed more length to this book to really expand it. And in fact, I continued feeling that way as we hit the epilogue, because the book ends with the takeover of Ayatollah Khomeini at the end of the revolution, basically. So it feels like it is a natural stopping point on the original Iranian regime of this period, but you want to hear what was the outcome. And so the first half of the epilogue, which is only like 25 pages, should have been another chapter. It feels like it's just another chapter, and it's all the play out of establishing the Ayatollah Khomeini's new leadership regime and what that was. And then at the halfway point, there's a big page break and it turns into a normal epilogue. So it feels like this could have used another 100 pages just building out that establishment of the new regime. And it feels like we stopped and rushed through that, really. So I think this was a book that really has great depth, but is a little uneven in that level of depth as it goes along. It does feel like it's rushing as you get toward the end, trying to wrap up. And I also felt this was lacking the Iranian civilian perspective. This does feel very in the regime, which is kind of cool and important. As an average person, you don't get that behind the scenes look at what the highest levels of government are doing on both the US and the Iranian side. And that is maybe another critique, is that this is very, very focused on US and Iran. There's nothing about other countries and what they're doing diplomatically at this time to do with Iran, and why the focus is so on America and so centralizing America rather than Iran as a country, and what was going on with the people there is not present other than filtered through the eyes of the leadership. And I struggled with that because I feel like most of the stories I have seen before, famously Persepolis, are really giving me more about what the individual person in Iran has experienced than I got in this book. And I think that would have been an important piece to include more of here that just isn't there. And I can understand limiting focus given this is so long, but it feels like we need a little bit more of that. So I'm almost arguing that this should have been a longer book. Like, this should have been double the size to really get everything richly in there. But in every way, this is a really exceptional book in terms of informing me about a topic I really didn't know anything about previously. That in Iran, there just was this dissatisfaction that rose to a radical far right coming out of a populist movement that was completely blindsiding the existing regime. And all of the level of choice that happened both with the US and the Iranian leadership in order to not look at that, to ignore any criticism as if it's unserious, really was a problem with this. And to not accept criticism at all, not introspect and reflect on problems with the regime, really led to a downfall. And that's kind of the hubris element. And so I think seeing all of that and seeing the flaws of this regime can really inform you a lot. So I think this was a very good book. I would argue it could have been about twice as long, and there was so much more I would have liked to see in it. But as a book that it is, I thought it was really great and would kind of heartily recommend it to just about any American. I think that it's lacking in international appeal, perhaps, but very, very informative, useful book. Today I finished Nobody's Girl, a memoir of surviving abuse and fighting for justice by Virginia Roberts Giuffre. And this was written in collaboration with someone, but they are not actually credited in the book, though they do have kind of a lengthy foreword, I guess, to the book, taken after this was collected and contextualizing a lot of their relationship with Virginia. So this was a very difficult read. It kind of reminded me a little bit of I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, because it's such graphic, difficult content that you are reading, and it's very real and raw, and you find her to be this very relatable person, even so. And despite all of that really difficult content, she's trying to balance that by interspersing anecdotes of her normal life with a husband and children in her adulthood. And so I don't know if that makes it better or harder to read, because you're seeing her as this person who has gone on to have this life that feels fairly normal, and knowing what lies underneath all of that. and just the hardships as you're reading through this. So I would say this is very difficult to read and comes with every trigger warning possible, because we start long before what this book is famous for, of her being sex trafficked as a young teen by Jeffrey Epstein. But prior to all of that, we have a litany of things in her life that were working against her that led her to that circumstance, to be the type of person who would be targeted, would be vulnerable to his predation. And so all of those things are happening early in this book when she's in a very young childhood. She's experiencing parental abuse, both sexual and physical, and emotional, I would say as well. She is sent to the sort of reprogramming camps for teens. She's sent to rehab. She goes through being a runaway. Like, all of those vulnerabilities that she's then trying to turn around, and has gotten a job in her early teens at Mar-a-Lago, a fairly innocuous, seemingly normal job, when she is recruited by Ghislaine Maxwell. And that leads us into the litany of even worse and just continual grooming her into a specific role, pushing boundaries, and getting her further and further into a mire of wealthy people in power who are trying to dominate her life and have total control over every aspect of her. And that you get a litany of stories about real experiences that she had. And again, it's kind of alternating between the past and more contemporary times in her having this normal life. And so you can see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel somewhat, and yet Virginia is not with us anymore. And there's been a lot of discussion about that, and about how she had said, oh no, I'm not actually considering this or anything like that. But toward the end of her life, she did go through very significant medical issues on top of everything that was going on with her. Physically and emotionally, she was really struggling. So as this persists, she is continuing to begin and progress a legal fight once she has the agency and the distance from all of this actually happening to her, and the support from a family that is behind her in doing that. She's actually making the legal fight, and she's becoming a voice publicly for this situation, and drawing other women around her who have experienced this, but her health is continually failing. And in that, she did end up feeling some self-harming thoughts, and that comes up in the book as well. So this is really difficult to read, knowing the outcome of this woman's life, knowing that she had such a vital role and impact in making a real difference, in exposing these predatory people who predated on her, but also on hundreds of other women. And she was part of the snowball that started rolling downhill toward them, really. So this is a very important book. I think it's written in a really accessible and also competent way. I think that she also didn't hide that she's a real person. A lot of times in this type of memoir, they have to portray themselves as a sort of a perfect victim, but she does very often show those sides of herself where she feels like she was part of wrongdoing, or where she just isn't a perfect person, or a perfect mother, or a perfect wife in so many ways, even as an adult, that you feel her humanity in this, I think. And I think that's really important to respect, that these people have flaws, and that's what led them to where they ended up, but that's because they're human, not because there's anything inferior to them. And I think this was just a really, really powerful memoir to read. So I think this is something that, particularly in our times, is very important for people to read, but at the same time, I acknowledge this is not going to be for a lot of people because of the vast amount of trigger warnings you have to be willing to wade through. It was pretty stomach-turning to read, particularly at the beginning, but it just persists on through the whole book. So very challenging read, but well worth it. So Baldwin, a love story by Nicholas Boggs. I feel I have very little to say about, despite it being by far the longest of my books this round at over 700 pages. It's a biography of James Baldwin, and it's exactly what it says on the tin, really. This is really great at covering the diverse range of topics within that area. So everything from his personal life, the political movements going on during this time, covering primarily the 50s, but really all the way from the 50s into the 80s. I hadn't even realized that Baldwin was alive concurrently with myself in the early 80s. So there were a lot of learning moments in the density of information about the history and the context, both at a personal and a global level. His travels throughout the world were really fascinating to learn about, especially in that political context where he spent time in his early life in New York, and that sort of northern perspective gave him a certain amount of freedom that he didn't have later in his life in the South, that he never reflected on until he lived in the South. But at the same time, his time spent in Europe and especially France gave him this additional freedom that he never felt in the US. And so the context of both his homosexuality and his race really played into the experiences that he had depending on where he was in the world over time. His political ideology and constant reformation of that, constant resistance to norms, is really powerful. However, as I was reading this, and this is not a real critique in any way, I did repeatedly find myself wishing I were reading Baldwin's work itself. And so much of this is really coming from an internal perspective and very much about his internal emotional state. And so you can tell that it is being pulled directly from a lot of personal writings. And I was just wanting to turn to those, which is kind of a sign of a very good book, but also means I was not wanting to read this book as much as I was wanting to turn to Baldwin. I also feel like, for me, when I'm looking at a biography that I can kind of give to anyone is just a really exceptional biography, it's something where I immerse in that person, and I really am just caught up in the existence of that person. And this was not that. So while this was truly a great biography as a biography, it wasn't that next echelon of something truly exceptional as a biography that I could kind of hand to anybody. I think this is mainly for people who are already very interested in Baldwin. It kind of feels like being in an English lit lecture. The tone and style are very, very much that. And I don't see that as a negative. I love English lit. I took a lot of English lit courses as electives. I really just loved that world and that style of presenting information. So this is a very, very good example of that, but it is still that. So this is kind of for literature nerds and people who love Baldwin, not the average reader, I think. I do think there's a lot of great information there. I also want to critique one thing, but it's very, very minor. The one minor critique is that this has chapters that are super lengthy and labeled as chapters, and it has some interludes, and also has a very, very lengthy epilogue. And none of those seem to be really distinct in style or came through clearly as what they were labeled as. So I didn't really understand sort of the form and structure of the book, because it just seemed like everything should have just been numbered chapters, really. There wasn't any distinguishing marks in the writing to the way things were divided. So it felt like that is a very, very minor thing that just didn't really make clear sense to me. So anyway, very, very good book, and a very good literary biography, but just not something I think is going to pull in the average non-reader, especially, much less someone who isn't particularly interested in Baldwin. I finished Raising Hare by Chloe Dalton. This is a nice little physical book to have, I will just point out, because it has nice end papers with a layout of Chloe Dalton's home and the path of the hare/leveret through her garden. And then every so often at the start of chapters, you get a little peek of a pencil drawing of the hare. And this is ostensibly a memoir. It's really focused on the nature writing, though I will say more so than a personal memoir of Dalton's life, though it is taking you through, and she's carrying you along with her as she experiences finding a baby leveret and trying to decide what to do in that situation, and then eventually bringing it home with her. Navigating very uncharted territory, because hares are not at all domesticated species, unlike rabbits. And so there's not a lot of information about what to do with them. And her fumbling her way through that, even as she's contacting the people you would think to, conservationists and veterinarians, they don't know what to do. So she casts a wide net in trying to find information. And I think that's what makes this so special and unique, that she's dug into history and science and biology and nature writing and also literature, even At one point, some of the best info she gets on feeding her hare is from a hundreds of years old poem. And so she is incorporating all of those diverse sources in this to share these details over time that people have imparted about hares who are not domesticated and so little known, really. And it's also special in that she restrains herself from really including her emotions in this, and she talks about that in an interview at the back of or at the end of the audiobook as well. And you can feel that. This is very much her observing. This is her recognizing a shift in perception in herself, both out of care for the hare itself and observing what it's doing, but her new perception of the world around her as she comes to understand it in the concerns of the hare. So this is mainly her giving us a sort of distanced observation as she's going along and this hare is growing up and the new things that she's finding. And through that new observation, we also get a lot of detail here that's weighty about humans' impact on the environment and ecological impacts. It's not this big, heavy topic, though. It's really about the small local effects. She's really considering walking through a field and recognizing the harms that humans are doing, considering her garden personally and how that impacts her hare. So this isn't going around trying to shove a big message at you. It's really thinking about the small things in our day-to-day lives and the way she has shifted in perceiving them, things she wouldn't have noticed even before. And so I think this is a very accessible book. It's beautifully written, though not overly flowery. It doesn't have appeals to emotion or big messages, really, though there are some layers there and depth in what she's getting across. But it feels like this is something just about anyone could read and feel the intimacy of this relationship that changes her perception of life, that she sees the fragility in this animal and something special that she creates bringing this wild animal into her home and choosing to respect its autonomy and allow it to cohabitate with her, allowing room for its needs over her trying to domesticate it. And that's a really, really unique and special story, I think, to tell. So I think just about anybody could read this and get something out of it. So, The Place of Tides by James Rebanks. It's a mix of things. It's a blend of memoir and nature writing, but I would say the quality and consistency of the prose in that nature writing is really what I would put forward as the big draw to this book, because not a lot really happens here. It's very, very quiet and slow paced. You see, Rebanks himself is suffering from a burnout and kind of wanting to walk away from his life and start over. And in doing that, he contacts an elderly woman he had met in the past who takes care of the migration and nesting of eider-down ducks on a remote island off of Norway. And this is a very long, laborious process. It's a heritage that's been passed down for years over very fraught periods when these ducks have nearly gone the way of the dodo, and through many threats, both natural and human, and yet she has kept this up. But this year that he is joining her turns out to be her last year. She's preparing to end this practice because she's simply gotten too old. It's very difficult and physically demanding, and she simply is struggling with it. And we do see that play out on the pages as she can only work for short periods of time every day. And obviously James knows nothing about this. There's one other woman there with them on the island who's kind of there as a friend and support for this lady that is responsible, but he is there to observe and see this process and simply be there to record this thing that's happening. And he does learn along the way to do this, but certainly not at the level of expertise that she has in building these nest boxes and preparing, and then also collecting the eider down was basically how this was a profitable practice for generations to get by doing this. And the incentive for sort of a symbiotic relationship between caring for these ducks and the needs of the humans. So we get that level of a history, a natural history of these ducks, of the threats that have been introduced into the environment for them over quite a long period of time, and the ways that's increasing. Their lives are very fraught and fragile, the ways they fear humans, but also rely on humans very much for this to continue. But we're also getting that personal story of his, of his finding himself come back as he is practicing this and finding the simple tasks and being able to just follow directions and move forward is really healing for him. And the simplicity and connection to the natural world being very important in reviving himself. He also contemplates, as the book is winding down, the ideas of the fact that this is the end. And for this one woman, hopefully she's winding down this lifetime of work and it won't cease the practice globally. Hopefully there will be a future for these ducks and someone will take over the caregiving. But as the book is winding down, that's an unknown. And so there aren't really solutions, but there is this observation of the importance that this has and the weight that this thing going away really does have an impact on the natural world. So this one is going to be one of my hardest ones to, I think, recommend, because I would say that, or to rank even, as part of this prize, because I responded to this very emotionally and strongly. I loved this book personally, but it's not quite entirely a nature book, and it doesn't offer a lot of solutions. Definitely. I think the things that it's observing and the things that it's contemplating are so meaningful and important without having a lot to say about them. They're just taking the moment to contemplate those things, I think, is of value. And so I responded to that, but I also responded very personally to his memoir aspects, because I've been going through quite similar feelings myself in my life over the past couple of years. And so I really connected with what he was saying about his own life. And just so much of this was so beautifully written that I really loved it. So across the board, this was like, me personally, I love this, but I don't know who to recommend it to, because it is so slow and so quiet and so in the breath of things. It's all about like taking in and sitting with the feelings of this, and not really a lot happening, and not really a lot challenging you even. So yeah, I don't know. And I think it's mainly going to be for nature writers, but I think a lot of, not nature readers, but I think a lot of nature writing readers are going to dislike the memoir element being strong there, and also are going to want more solutions. And that's just not really what this is about. This is much more meditative. So I don't know where I'm gonna place this as of right now. I think this one's gonna require a lot of thinking about whether I put it very high up or whether it's somewhere more middling, because it is just beautifully written. So at very least, I would recommend it on that basis. So that means my very final ranking was Daughters of the Bamboo Grove in 6th. In 5th place, King of Kings. In 4th place, Nobody's Girl. In 3rd place, Baldwin, A Love Story. In 2nd place, Raising Hare. And in 1st place, The Place of Tides. This was a really, really hard year for me to rank everything, mainly because normally I try really hard to look objectively and not react on pure emotion. And I feel that Baldwin was the most objectively just that top notch of quality and consistency. The effort is very present, but at the same time, I think that Raising Hare and The Place of Tides, I reacted to so strongly emotionally that I just had to put them forward. And they're both great books as well. So I'm hopeful that those 3 will go forward. But if not, I think I would be happy with any of these books, because while I did have some critiques for some of the books, I think these are all pretty worthy, incredibly informative, well-crafted works. So that is the end of my semifinal round, and by the time you're seeing this, I will hopefully be starting to jump into the final round reading. So let's look forward to that in another 2 months. Thank you so very much for watching.